On behalf of the Berkeley Center and the 9/11 Memorial and Museum, I would like to welcome you to this afternoon's symposium. 9/11 changed everything. It's a common trope, but it is not clear that our personal, social, political lives have been significantly transformed by September 11th. This may be a sign, among other things, of human stubbornness, indifference, or perhaps our ability to recover. President Bush took his lumps from all sides when he attempted to urge calm in a shaky public. Many of you will remember this quotation. When they struck, they wanted to create an atmosphere of fear. And one of the great goals of this nation's war is to restore public confidence in the airline industry and to tell the traveling public, get on board, do your business around the country, fly and enjoy America's great destination spots, go down to Disney World in Florida, take your families and enjoy life the way we want it to be enjoyed. Looking back over the past 8 years, we seem to have taken his advice. The profound hand-in-hand gentleness and solidarity that erupted after the attacks, I thought, and this is going to date me, I thought for a moment we might actually live in the country envisioned in that Coca-Cola commercial, I'd like to buy the world a Coke, along with a fear of another imminent attack, embraced our shocked nation and gave most of us a hope that we might build a more respectful society, if but for a moment. This soon gave way to our general grumblings and annoyance at airport security lines, and frustrations, even rage with an administration aimed at protecting the nation at costs some deemed too high for us to bear. But life has visibly changed in some other areas. 2 visible memorials are taking shape. In the coming 2 years, the National September 11th Memorial and Museum is rising up as a monument to the horrific attacks and the countless ways that we have recovered. Likewise, a brilliant film project, Project Rebirth, will be released soon that chronicles the physical rebuilding of the site and the resilience of 10 people directly affected by the attacks, struggling to rebuild their lives and find hope in the past 8 years. At a personal level, Americans seem to trust the Muslim doctors, shopkeepers, lawyers, taxi drivers, and engineers, who are their neighbors, somewhat less and discriminate against them somewhat more. A most recent national survey by the Pew Forum on Religion and Public Life, just released this past week, found that nearly 6 in 10 adults say that Muslims are subject to a lot of discrimination, far more than say the same about Jews, evangelical Christians, atheists, or Mormons. That same poll shows a split, however, in whether Americans think Muslims as a group encourage violence. The quote from the report, a plurality of the public, 45%, says Islam is no more likely than other faiths to encourage violence. But at the same time, 38% think that it is more likely. The peak was about 3 years ago at 45 to 50%. It started at less than 25% in 2001. Some of the most interesting changes can be seen in universities. Students are flocking to study Arabic language and literature. Courses exploring regions, religions, and cultures in the Middle East and Asia are booming. Students are invigorated to understand the way religious cultures and practice, particularly about Islam, intersect with geopolitics and social behavior around the globe. Scholars, too, are expanding their focus to include a more sophisticated assessment of religious culture and communal life as a core component of assessing any group or political organization's economic, political, and social behaviors. At the same time, universities are spearheading collaborative partnerships with foreign governments in the Middle East, particularly Education City in Doha, Qatar, which Georgetown is a participant in. Personally, I've had the pleasure as a scholar at Georgetown to work on some of these issues in ways that I never, ever expected. Georgetown has built a collaboration with the National September 11th Memorial and Museum. Through public programs and educational endeavors, we seek the best way to portray the complex geopolitical, cultural, and religious forces that contributed to the 9/11 attacks. I have been professionally challenged and enriched in working with the team, including Alice Greenwald, the director, Caitlin Olson, Clifford Shannon, and Sonnet Takahisa. I welcome them back to Georgetown, thank them for the growing collaboration, and look forward to many future projects together. Likewise, a team at Georgetown, led by Randy Bass, is collaborating with Project Rebirth and Columbia University to think through the myriad intellectual issues raised by the film, including how best to use the footage for future learning, and how film in general can help promote intercultural and interreligious understanding. Georgetown and Columbia in particular are helping Project Rebirth develop a powerful teaching tool that uses the thousands of hours of footage of persons recovering from mass trauma to help train future physicians, chaplains, mental health professionals, and disaster recovery leaders. The director of that film is Jim Whitaker, an alum of the university and a hugely accomplished filmmaker. Brian Rafferty is chair of the board of Project Rebirth and a member of the Georgetown Board of Regents and an alum of the class of 1979. Another member of the Project Rebirth board, John Wood, Georgetown class of 1985, is also in attendance. I welcome them back to Georgetown. Where our collective remembering and recovery leads us as individuals, communities, and as nations around the globe, that all remains to be seen. Challenges lie ahead. Fortunately, today, we have a tremendous opportunity to hear from some of Georgetown's leading faculty about how scholars in academic disciplines have adapted or changed their approaches and topics, if they've changed at all, in the post-9/11 world. In a moment, I will introduce the panelists. But first, I would like to ask our partner in this event, Alice Greenwald of the National September 11 Memorial and Museum, to offer some brief remarks. Alice is the Memorial Museum Director and Executive Vice President for Programs. She joined the museum in 2006 to oversee implementation of the vision for the museum and for the eventual and now actual programming in operation. Her prior positions include Associate Director for Museum Programs at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, the Executive Director of the National Museum of American Jewish History in Philadelphia, and Curator of the Hebrew Union College Skirball Museum in Los Angeles. She holds a Master's in History of Religions from the University of Chicago and a BA in English Literature and Anthropology from Sarah Lawrence College. Please join me in welcoming Alice Greenwald.
Thank you, Michael, and good afternoon. It is a real privilege for us to be here today and to participate in this symposium after September 11th, Change in the Academy. Today's program represents, as Michael has explained, an exciting extension of a collaboration that has been growing between the National September 11th Memorial and Museum and Georgetown's Berkeley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs, a collaboration that originated, as we now know, through our partnership with yet another program that has a great Georgetown connection, and that is Project Rebirth. And I do want to thank Brian Rafferty, a Hoya, for being with us today. This past April, I was honored to participate in Georgetown's John Carroll Weekend in New York City, where I was offered an opportunity to provide an update on the development of the Memorial Museum and the progress of rebuilding at the World Trade Center site. Our educational programs, which are already in process at the museum, even though we don't have a building yet, are being developed in cooperation and collaboration and with guidance from Georgetown Center for New Designs in Learning and Scholarship. Members of our exhibition development team recently met with Georgetown faculty at our offices in New York to seek their guidance on how to portray accurately and objectively the complex narratives surrounding the perpetrators of the 9/11 plot, presenting in a succinct fashion the various geopolitical, cultural, and religious factors that contributed to the lead up to 9/11. In short, we discussed with these people, these wonderful experts and thinkers, the most complicated and sensitive issue the museum will have to face and have to address, which is, why did these events happen? This question, necessitating a rigorous investigation by scholars, is actually the very same question we heard repeatedly as we toured 25 states a few years ago with a national memorial and museum tour. We are committed to addressing difficult questions head on. As the organization responsible for creating a memorial and museum to the nearly 3,000 innocent victims of 9/11, our challenge is to balance and, when appropriate, blend the twin missions of commemoration and education. We're striving to realize two things. First, commemoration. By honoring the victims of 9/11, we honor victims of terrorism all around the world. The people that were killed on September 11th were just like us. They were parents, children, brothers, sisters, cousins, neighbors, friends, colleagues, husbands, wives. All they did that day was what we all do every day. They got up, they went to work, and they got caught in the vortex of global events. Secondly, we are committed to education. While we honor the lives of the victims, we also aspire to educate the millions of people who will visit Ground Zero each year through our museum, which will recognize the events of 9/11 as part of an ongoing story, one that existed well before that fateful day and one that continues to shape our world well beyond it. We look forward to the continued fruitful collaboration with our colleagues here at Georgetown, and I want to especially thank Michael Kessler, Assistant Director at the Berkeley Center, Tom Banchoff, Director of the Berkeley Center, and President Jack DeGioia for your hospitality and our participation today. Thank you.
Thank you, Alice. It is now my pleasure to introduce the panel for this afternoon. And first a note, Ali Moghadam, professor in psychology, sends his regrets. He had a family emergency come up this morning and unfortunately can't be with us today. First, David Luban is university professor and professor of law and philosophy at Georgetown. He has written on just war theory, torture, and the role of lawyers in the conflict with al-Qaeda. He is also an award-winning scholar of legal ethics. His most recent books are Legal Ethics and Human Dignity, and he is the co-author of International and Transnational Criminal Law, a forthcoming legal casebook. Luban has been a fellow of the Woodrow Wilson Center and has held a Guggenheim Fellowship. Daniel Madigan is an Australian Jesuit priest who joined Georgetown's Department of Theology in 2008. He is also a senior fellow of the Prince Al-Walid bin Talal Center for Muslim Christian Understanding and a senior fellow at the Woodstock Theological Center, where he directs a project on Christian theologies that are responsive to Islam. Before moving to Georgetown, he taught in Rome, where he was the founder and director of the Institute for the Study of Religions and Cultures at the Pontifical Gregorian University. His main fields of teaching and research are Quranic studies, interreligious dialogue, and particularly Muslim-Christian relations. Clyde Wilcox is professor in the government department. His research and teaching interests broadly range on public opinion and electoral behavior, religion and politics, gender politics, the politics of social issues such as abortion, gay rights, and gun control, interest group politics, and campaign finance. He has authored, co-authored, edited, or co-edited more than 30 books, including the co-edited volumes The Politics of Same-Sex Marriage and The Values Campaign, The Christian Right in the 2004 Elections. And finally, Clifford Shannon, our moderator this afternoon, is Senior Program Advisor for the National September 11th Memorial and Museum, where he focuses on exhibition development and public and academic programs. He produces and moderates the museum's webcast series, Exploring 9/11, The World Before and After, and he curated the museum's 5th anniversary commemorative exhibition, 9/11 and the American Landscape, the photographs of Jonathan Hyman. He is co-editor of Blooming Through the Ashes, an anthology on violence in the human spirit. And for 10 years, Shannon was Associate Director of Arts and Humanities at the Rockefeller Foundation, where he developed programs on pluralism and development in the Muslim world. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming the panelists for this afternoon's symposium.
Thank you, Michael. Is that on? Okay. Thank you, Michael. I want to add my own voice to Alice's thanks and appreciation for the partnership that we're developing with Georgetown and the Berkeley Center. Our hopes for active educational and academic outreach and programming are becoming very much reinforced by the work we're doing here with Georgetown, and we're very pleased about that. I also would like to thank everybody for turning out today. It's nice of you to take a break in your summer vacation to come in and listen to the panel. That's a joke about how warm it is down here. We're going to have an informal conversation, I hope, and we will turn over at a later point the microphone on the floor so we can have some questions and comments from those of you who are here. But in starting, I did want to ask our panelists to reflect on a question that those of us who are involved with the museum often ask, or we're often told, people's stories about what happened on 9/11, their own 9/11 stories. But I'd like to take a little twist on that as we get started. Obviously, watching something as large and as horrible as that provokes a certain number of human reactions, general reactions that most or all of us would share. But I'm wondering, for those of you whose work has now been touched by that, at what point did your response to 9/11 move from this sort of immediate human reaction to the tragedy that befell New York, Washington, and in Shanksville? How did it become a matter of professional concern? Was there a particular moment where that happened for you, a particular incident, or was this sort of bound up in your first reactions from the very beginning? And so let me turn to the end of the panel, David Luban, and start for a couple of minutes, if you would, with you.
Yeah. Thank you. And is this on? Can you all hear me? Okay. My professional response to 9/11 was very disconnected from the personal response. The personal response was, I think, a 9/11 story like many people's, touched by the fact that I work at the Law Center, which is just a few blocks from the Capitol. So the day itself just sticks in my mind as a series of snapshots of sitting in the cafeteria watching the TV screen with hundreds of students and faculty as the towers came down. The rumors and worries about was there a strike against the Capitol, hearing about the Pentagon. Later, every Georgetown law student has some friend who is working in New York, and all the cell phones were down. And so a steady stream of students into the office of myself and my colleagues to use the landlines to try to find out if people were safe. My own reactions in how are my kids, who were many miles away, how are they getting home from high school given that it seems like the metro is down and the buses are down. So just snapshots like that. Further snapshots of a kind of almost dementia that set in for days and weeks after, sometimes manifesting. For me, it was that every day as I drove down North Capitol toward the Law Center, feeling like I had a big target painted on my back. But other people's stories were sometimes comic. A friend told me about how after the anthrax scare, she got a mailing, a piece of junk mail that she transported to her garage in tongs. It was from a local church. It was asking if she wanted to come and try them out. But there was that kind of traumatized reaction. There was the horror of learning that in my little town of University Park, Maryland, 5 of my neighbors, including 2 of my daughter's school friends, had died in the Pentagon, the Pentagon attack. The professional reaction was, the short story is how does a mild-mannered professional ethicist with an interest in human rights law morph over the period of 8 years into somebody whose expertise is now on something that I didn't even think existed then, the law of torture, and an expert on the Commander-in-Chief Clause of the Constitution, not one of the hit parade before 9/11. And in the international law of terrorism. And the answer is that it happened with maybe 3 discrete episodes. The first was about a year after, close to a year after 9/11, when it became clear that the legal response, the government's legal response and arguments were to create rightless legal black holes to put detainees in with kind of what I think of as heads I win, tails you lose arguments. You're not civilians because you're warriors. You're not prisoners of war because you're civilians. You have neither of those sets of rights. And I began thinking as a legal scholar, what does this do worldwide to the level of protection of human rights if this situation persists? Does it mean that we depress the level of human rights from that which we are used to thinking of in normal peace times to the lower level of human rights that are protected by the laws of war? The second was, of course, the Iraq War, when as somebody who has written on just war theory before, I began trying to think through the issues surrounding preventive war. And the third was the release of the torture memoranda in 2004, when as somebody who teaches legal ethics, the question arose, how do lawyers get involved in giving deeply flawed, what I think of as bad faith legal advice to legitimize torture, and it became kind of a preoccupation that's existed ever since. So I would say that my scholarly response has been driven not so much by 9/11 itself as by governmental responses to it, which raise some of the most profound legal issues about human rights, about civil rights, about constitutional structure and the structure of government, and about the nature of what lawyers do when they're advising clients.
Thank you. Maybe Father Madigan, if you would take a shot.
I'm almost ashamed to say that the towers had already fallen by the time I knew anything was going on September the 11th. I was in Rome, and I'd been in my office, I'd been in class, and the corridors of an ecclesiastical university are not quite as replete with video screens and information as they are around here, so we caught up with things rather late. But I remember vividly when someone told me this had happened, and I scarcely believed it, and I went upstairs and I watched the replays, and I felt sick at that moment. I suppose because this event came right into the middle of my professional life, because my work is in Islamic Studies and in Muslim-Christian relations. And in that moment, I said to myself, have I been complicit in something here? Have I been spending all these years trying to get people to think more positively about Muslims and to develop more friendly relations between Muslims and Christians? Have I been somehow part of the cover? And is the cover now finally off? Is this what Islam is about? Is this what Muslims do? And so it was a moment of crisis for me in a way. It touched me very personally, though I didn't know anyone who was actually who died in the attacks. So coming into the middle of my professional work, in one sense it spurred me further. That was a momentary reaction, because I realized, well, I have two choices. I can either join the people now who want to erect further barriers and to try and separate Muslims from Christians, who want to increase the level of suspicion, who want to give credence to the idea that all Muslims are like this and that Islam is essentially incompatible with life on this planet. Or I can redouble my efforts to try and introduce Muslims and Christians to one another. So it has been, I'd have to say, a real push to my professional work. It's also led, I suppose, to the kind of popularization of Islamic studies. I got into this business on the basis of a letter from Rome, which told me, please go and do a doctorate in Islamic studies. And so there I was with a qualification and in a particular area, which even in 2000 and pre-September the 11th was considered kind of exotic, perhaps a bit marginal. But suddenly my specialty was right in the middle of things, and I was in the middle of a growth industry. It meant that there were a great deal more calls on my time, and that I think was positive, because it really brought me out of the academy more into parishes and civic groups, small towns in Italy. A lot more people were interested to know something and felt they needed to know something, so it probably multiplied my work 4 or 5 times, and that was great. At the same time, I think it made the work a little more difficult, because I work in the field of theology, and my interest really is in how Muslims and Christians relate to one another as believers, and how we have different takes on a similar scriptural history, but almost every event then became a political event. And it was very difficult, and it remains difficult, I think, in the academy to justify for people a focus on religion and theology when what they're concerned about is security and politics and global relations of that sort. So people in my line, and I think Paul Heck, who's my colleague in the theology department in this area, we both find that it's important not to allow the security concerns and the politics to take over, and that the theological, to treat Muslims as believers and to treat Islam as a religious choice, that can get lost. I'll give you an example. I was giving a talk out in Bethesda recently at a parish, and the talk was advertised as people of the word. Muslims and Christians look at John's gospel together. Okay. No, you can't get much more theological than that. And at the end of the evening, I asked the group to tell me what they would like to do the following week, and was there anything in particular they'd like followed up. And a woman who'd paid very close attention, was always smiling and very engaged, put up her hand and she said, I'm really surprised that you went throughout this whole evening without even mentioning terrorism. You know, I was expecting to speak about terrorism. I thought, well, you know, what don't you get about John's gospel? Everything cannot simply be reduced to that issue, and that is one of the things which we've had to struggle with, I think, in the academy, at the same time as being having an opportunity to be more present in the academy. I think we've also had to stand our ground as religious studies and theologians.
Thank you.
Well, I did know some of the innocent victims on 9/11, although I didn't discover this until the next day. In terms of professional impact, the State Department brings over a lot of international visitor groups from across the world, and I've been speaking to those groups for 20 years, but they created a very special project after 9/11 to bring lots of groups from the Islamic world. I've probably met with 100 groups from, you know, different countries and so forth, and had an opportunity to make a lot of interesting friendships. As a result of that, I've been invited to go lecture in Jordan and Turkey and the Emirates, and the State Department also then at some point asked me to help train their diplomats in how to talk about these issues, and so I've been working with the State Department on that as well. But my personal research has not been very much affected except in one area. I do research on public opinion, and because of my own normative reaction to our treatment of prisoners in Guantanamo, I've been doing some research on public attitudes towards the use of torture, and to what extent fear and to what extent understanding of different faiths and so forth can mitigate those particular sets of attitudes. I haven't published this work yet, but it is really the only research that I've done that's related to 9/11.
Thank you. In each of the answers you've given, there's a tension, it seems, between the normal practice of the discipline, the work that you had been doing, and the new situation, the crisis situation we're in, and the tension that pulls you in different directions, whether it's constitutional rights or the training of diplomats or a better explication of interfaith commonalities and differences for parish and academic groups. You know, how does the academy balance these kinds of things? Is it automatic, do you think, that in response to a crisis of 9/11 that there is a new urgency to what you're doing, or is this something that once the crisis subsides a bit, you can go back to the normal practices of the discipline, even if some of your subject matter has changed, but you're doing it essentially in the same way? Are you pursuing these things in the same way, or is there a different tone or tenor to what you're doing because we've gone through this crisis? Let's start at this end with Clyde Wilcox.
Well, my profession is probably the most events-influenced of all the disciplines up here, which is to say that when the real world changes, sometimes it really gives problems for our theories. But the fall of the Soviet Union was a real discipline shaker for us because we had a lot of theories about international relations and comparative politics that were proven false there. The rise of religion in politics with the Islamic Revolution, the rise of the moral majority, and a pope so deeply involved with solidarity was another that really shook the discipline. 9/11, I don't think, really changed the profession of political science very much. We are a very fragmented subfield, and I think that maybe the one place where it made the biggest difference was in international relations, where there was still a pretty sizable group of scholars who said that the only thing that matters is nation states. And, of course, we had some early leaders in the argument that international actors and social movements and so forth matters, including George Shamball and Roy Godson. But I think that really got a boost there. Comparative politics has been a little changed. There's a lot more graduate student interest in the Middle East. It's hard to know how long that will last. When the Soviet Union collapsed, there was a ton of interest in post-Soviet politics. So I think what really happens for scholars is if there's a normative concern or if there's it overlaps something you're already working on. Jim Piffner out of George Mason University has written a really fine book about presidential excess in the times of the War on Terror, and he was already interested in this topic, so he was drawn to it. But the profession itself is not driven by events, it's only influenced by them.
Yeah, I think certainly that the events did have their effect and their influence, but there are other things happening, I suppose, which are influencing the field of theology, and that would be even with regard to Muslim-Christian relations, because the increasing Muslim immigration, the increasing presence, public presence of Muslims in U.S. society and in U.S. academia, where so I think within the discipline of theology there is a much greater sense of the need to develop a theology which takes into account not only Judaism, which has been a development in Christian theology recently, but also Islam, as indeed other religious traditions. So that movement was already taking place, and I suppose Islam was made a bit more present by September the 11th and its follow-up, but there are other factors which are maintaining that change.
I guess I'm supposed to speak about two disciplines, since both in philosophy and in the law school. I think that that 9/11 has had very little impact on what the disciplines of philosophy are. I mean, face it, the critique of pure reason says the same thing after 9/11 as it said before, and you approach it in much the same way. Within the law school, a great deal of what my colleagues do is completely uninfluenced by 9/11. My friend Deborah Epstein, who is our clinical director and directs our domestic violence clinic, has the same docket of battered and abused clients that the clinic has always had, and 9/11 didn't change that. But for a lot of us, I think that the changes went really in two directions. First, law schools are places in which scholarship, almost by definition, responds to changes in the law. And so there has been a big shift of interest to those sets of changes in the law. And I used to joke that just as lawyers in Texas and Oklahoma all have to study oil and gas law for the state bar exam, post 9/11, everybody needs to know national security law and the laws governing terrorism, surveillance, and the like. But I think, to me, the second really important thing is that all of the events around 9/11 have become very deeply politicized. And I think that it's the moral obligation of a scholar, especially a scholar in a law school where, since lawyers are advocates, there is always this sense that you should be advocating a position, to fight back against that temptation and try to be as objective as we possibly can. So in some sense, 9/11, I think, was a new wave of threat to what I see as the central academic mission of the university, which demands objectivity in scholarship as the first virtue. And we've all had to push harder than ever against the temptation to deviate from that.
Let me ask, and this would go, I guess, to some of the polling work that Clyde Wilcox has done. You know, we live in a polarized time anyway, and that sort of political polarization precedes 9/11. But is the factor of 9/11, the tension that came into society post 9/11, has that made the political polarization in our society, and if you want to speak globally, that's fine too, but I was speaking more about the U.S., has that made it even worse? Is it a factor in increasing polarization, or not particularly?
No, I think that the polarization gets reflected through people's attitudes. There is some people are more risk averse than others. Some people are more afraid than others based on events. When the snipers were here in Washington, I saw someone pumping his gas and then running serpentine to go pay for it.
That would have been me.
Right? And so what our polling work shows is that, you know, conservatives, Republicans favored Bush's approach to the war on terror, and moderates were more conflicted and so forth. That polarization was already there, but cutting across the parties was, you know, feelings about risks and also openness to the other. So some people are really interested in people who are different than them, and some people are really afraid of them. And so those kind of underlying tensions, you know, overlay some of the polarization, but it didn't really increase polarization.
Well, let me pick up on that question of risk, because if I think of the other two panelists here, it seems very clear that in the work that you've described, whether consciously or implicitly, there is a question of risk that can be distorted or can be real, but might be enhanced in a post-9/11 awareness. You speak about your first reaction to hearing of the attacks, and then later the responses of your parish audiences to the kind of speaking that you're doing. How do you recalculate notions of risk in light of the kind of academic work you're doing? And does risk figure into your own personal views, if they've changed in any way, on these kinds of rather abstruse, complex, theological or philosophical subjects? Father Madigan, let me ask you first.
Theology is not usually considered a very risky business.
But interfaith relations may well be, yeah.
Yeah, it's interfaith relations are somewhat risky in the sense that in any community, religious community, you can be seen as marginal. You can be seen as a kind of fifth column. You're having truck with the enemy, and this is seen particularly in times when polarization is strong. I guess when it comes to risk, you know, there are risks. You know, there are dangerous Muslims. That there are people who are continuing to plot the overthrow, and there are dangerous Christians, and you know, there are people to be afraid of, and there are risks. What I think happened, maybe Samuel Huntington comes into this because he comes up all the time. Everybody has a half-baked idea of Samuel Huntington and what he said. And I think his theory has got much more longevity out of this period than it deserved, because in fact he was proven wrong on the facts already in the 90s. You know, because he posited the idea that the conflicts between civilizational groups would be much more bloody and much more conflictual than conflicts within civilizational groups. But if we count up if we do the body count, the most bloody conflicts have been within what we would call civilizational groups. You think of Rwanda, you think of the Congo, even now you think of Iraq or Afghanistan. These are not things between the Islamic civilization and the Western civilization. He was proven wrong, but people still think that the undoubted risks we have and the dangers there undoubtedly are somehow essentially a part of Islam, or essentially a part of a conflict that is unavoidable between Islam and the West. And I think this is a fundamental problem. It adds to polarization, but it also increases the sense of risk, because everyone, if you take that essentialist discourse, then everyone who identifies as a Muslim is somehow dangerous. and you're at risk. So I think Huntington and those who continue to half read him and quote him has done us a disservice this way, and it keeps coming up in just about every parish talk.
Yeah, and thought about risk, I think, permeates law. I mean, the biggest place that it appears is simply in the question, how absolute are anybody's rights, and can rights be balanced off against heightened risk? I mean, let me illustrate with the torture debate, which is something that I've focused extensively on for several years. The United States is party to the Convention Against Torture. It's an international treaty to outlaw torture. And one of the articles of that treaty says that no emergency, no war can possibly justify torture. And we signed on to that without taking any legal reservations or understandings about it. Now, that clearly turned out not to be the way in which we actually operated. And it's not the way that the general public thinks. The latest poll, once again, this is by Pew, the Pew Foundation, shows that close to half of Americans answer yes, either often or sometimes, to the question, should suspected terrorists be tortured for information? Now, notice that doesn't say terrorists, it says suspected terrorists. And so roughly 50% of people say often or sometimes. Slightly more than 50% say seldom or never. Now, clearly, what's going on there is this sense that if it's a question of my risks versus the suspected terrorists' supposedly absolute right against torture, the right gets balanced away. And there are significant legal scholars who believe that that is the correct approach to rights. There's a book about emergency powers by the University of Chicago professor Eric Posner and now Harvard Law professor Adrian Vermeule that argues that rights should always be balanced against risks. Now, if you combine this with one of the most established facts of experimental social psychology, which is that people tend to way overestimate small risks if they're very salient. That would include the risk of my perishing in a terror attack, and it makes us, I think, much more, it makes the argument that rights aren't absolute, that rights should be balanced against risks, a much more persuasive one. The law may be different than public opinion, but it always flows slower or faster along the lines of public opinion. So I think that within both legal scholarship, law, and public views about law, the issue of risk is an extraordinarily important one.
David Luban spoke about this issue of, I've lost my place, this issue of focus on the risk to society in general, how that filters through the law. I'm wondering if we can turn that in some way towards the university and the question of risk as it is now faced by a younger generation of students who are coming into a post-9/11 world. Have you noticed in terms of your teaching, and I realize you may not have been here, but nonetheless we can talk about it a bit, have you noticed a difference in both their sense of risk in the world and perhaps their expectation of the university? Have their criteria for what they're looking for, what they're hoping the university will respond to, have those things changed since 9/11? Let me start down with you.
Yeah, I actually have not seen that. I think that the interests of law students have moved much more in the direction of subjects that are related to the war on terror. So they sign up for courses on these subjects much more frequently. We have a large component, relatively large component of law students who have seen risk firsthand because they fought in Iraq or Afghanistan and then come to law school afterwards. But I don't think that the overall level of personal risk or obsession with it has changed much. And what I see among students is more my intellectual interests and interests as a U.S. and world citizen. now make me think about things that I might not have beforehand, but I don't think that it digs down into the level of, has my personality changed so that now I'm more freaked out about risk?
Let me ask Professor Wilcox to answer that one, because I have a gloss on it that I'd like to change a bit for Father Madigan. Please.
Before I answer this, I just wanted to say one thing about public opinion on torture. There's actually another very interesting survey that PIPA did, which is a survey firm over at the University of Maryland, where they asked people what they thought was acceptable torture. And, you get these numbers which are kind of really disconcerting, that over half are willing to do these things. But it turns out that the modal tipping point for people is loud music. So maybe listening to Helen Reddy cranked up a little loud, and that beyond that is there's less than 50% support. In terms of Georgetown, our graduate students, we have many, many graduate students very interested in the Middle East, interested also in how to design democratic institutions that would engage Islamist forces and give them a stake in the system, at the same time allowing balance in the political system so that no one takes over the system very quickly. Our undergraduates profess to be more interested in it, but I think they really, once you get past the one level of detail, they're pretty much, they're not quite as interested as they thought they were. So.
Father Madigan, the gloss I wanted to add was Georgetown's identity as a Catholic university, and whether, in light of this cataclysm and the clash of civilizations theory that you've evoked, and of course the work that Georgetown was doing pre-9/11, but which is certainly characteristic of your own academic involvement, is there something particular about a post-9/11 Georgetown or a post-9/11 Catholic-centered university that comes to mind in terms of the conversation we've been having?
I don't know that it's connected much with notions of risk, except that I think I'd want to say that we sense an obligation not to close down and not to close in. I think that the temptation in a situation like this is to become closed. As you know, I'm relatively new to the Georgetown campus, but one thing I do note is that with the connection with Qatar, for example, having the School of Foreign Service campus there in Education City, but also the presence of Muslim students on this campus and their integration into things in class situations and the Ramadan iftars and various other things. I think there is welcome evidence that we haven't allowed ourselves to close down and to allow fear to dominate, even though it does at times become difficult to bring in students, because of visa concerns. That there are always those issues. But Georgetown as a Catholic university and as a Jesuit university has one of its objectives and main objectives interreligious understanding, and this is a time when it's tested, really. How much are we committed to this, or are we prepared to sort of take the easy way out and say, well, let's put it in the too hard basket? So I don't think we've done that, and I'm glad to see it.
Professor Luban spoke before about the need for objective research as a central mission of the university, and one presumes that that's unchanged in a post-9/11 world, though I guess in your view more important than ever. I mean, is there something that either of the other panelists would like to add to this notion of the university's mission, whether it's the same as before or not, but somehow may seem more valuable in a time of crisis or when there are all kinds of other pressures exerted on the university through the political and cultural conflicts within the society? Maybe Professor Wilcox can start that.
Well, I guess when I was hired here 25 years ago or whatever, I was told that Georgetown sort of had a very special tradition of interest in normative issues and issues of public policy concern. And so in a certain sense, Georgetown very certainly, this is right at the intersection of these things, right? And so, yeah, I do think that universities are places where scholars have an obligation to think about important issues of their day, and normative issues are what helps me sort of decide sometimes what I'm going to work on. Sometimes it's theoretical issues, but yeah, I think so.
Father Madigan.
I've just forgot the question for the moment.
The issue. I'm sorry.
Sorry.
I'm sorry.
Blank.
The issues of the university's mission and how it changes or doesn't in light of the crisis.
Yes, the question of objectivity. I mean, people want us and expect us, rightly, I think, to be objective about the other in this situation. We often get a certain implicit, sometimes explicit criticism of being on the side of the other, and we're not objective about Muslims because we've got Muslim friends, or you've studied Islam too long, so you're not really objective anymore. Better let Samuel Huntington tell you the truth about this. But I think on the other side, what can be lost in a situation like this is a certain objectivity about ourselves. 9/11 was not the bloodiest day in U.S. history. A lot more children have died of hunger and banal diseases in Africa today, probably, than people died in 9/11. To get an objective sense of our world and the scale of this disaster, it's not always a welcome message. So people like objectivity up to a point, but if the objectivity starts to interfere with the story we tell ourselves, it can become unwelcome. So I think the Academy, in this respect, is obligated to tell a few objective truths to our culture about itself, not simply about the other.
May I add?
Please.
Yeah. I think one important issue about objectivity has to do to move to the most mundane level, to funding. Now, to do legal research, I need a computer terminal, a printer, and a wastebasket, and that's about it. The old joke is that in philosophy, you don't need the wastebasket. But there are a lot of disciplines that are whose budgets are heavily driven by government funding, and where the government funding goes changes the focus of interest. I mean, there are $43 billion in Homeland Security research money, and it means that in a discipline like applied mathematics, for example, there's a lot more that will be spent to drive mathematicians into working on encryption and decryption issues. I was told by a political scientist friend that now there's studying root causes of terrorism is very unpopular, and it's hard to get research money to do that, whereas doing the kind of research that presupposes that certain programs are okay are very, very heavily funded. I mean, there's always been a way in which the university sits in the world in which the possibility of having research be dollar-driven is I think, a big threat to objectivity. I mean, ironically, I have never thought that it was culture wars stuff, like the tenured radicals in the literature departments, that it's always been somebody who is in the medical school who's doing research on pharmacology and might be coming up with an awkward fact about the way that some very profitable medication works. And I think that we can't be blind to the threat to objectivity that a dollar-driven agenda can impose. I mean, I think that to me the most dramatic example has been in the discipline of psychology, where, as many of you may know, the American Psychological Association, which includes both academic psychologists and also psychologists in private practice, has been convulsed for 4 years over the issue of participation of psychologists in the interrogation of detainees. And a number of academic psychology departments have voted to quit the APA en masse. I was one of the small colleges, Bates College maybe, or Colby, that began. And then there was a kind of cascade of academic institutions which the psychology departments were resigning from the APA. And this is a place in which there's an enormous amount of Defense Department money that goes to psychologists that are trying to figure out how do you How do you break down a terrorist suspect without leaving scars or causing blood to flow? And that has been a gigantic issue that I think it drives academic research. It threatens academic research. Academic research has been both implicated and also implicated in the fight on the other side. I mean, it's a huge issue in that discipline.
This issue of professional standards, which has come up in David Leben's research, is also one that I'm interested in, whether or not, and I'm not looking for you to tell tales out of school, but how have these things come into the life of a faculty member here at Georgetown? Is there something particular that you can think of where it comes home, not in terms of your academic work, but in terms of relationships with colleagues or stances that departments take, or the position of this university or other universities in relation to some particular aspect of these controversial issues?
Well, when I first took on the State Department class, this was a really tricky issue for me in a lot of ways, because I thought it was fundamentally important for our diplomats to be able to talk to the Muslim world and explain various aspects of our public life. At the same time, the job of a diplomat is to defend and promote foreign policy, no matter whether they agree with it or not. And the official policy they had to promote was, we don't torture, we don't do rendition, we're treating everyone in Guantanamo with full rights of prisoners of war. And of course, in my view, that was not a correct situation. So I was sort of dealing with the normative issue of, is it better to be working with them to help them explain this longer term or not? And in the end, I ended up concluding that the soft diplomacy answer to this is that all societies react in great fear when they've been threatened, and that often they overreact, and we've done this earlier in our history as well, but that the balance of institutions is designed at least to help people who are more level-headed to regain the upper ground. And so after the Civil War, the presidential power is curtailed. Very seldom could a diplomat say that in a formal setting, but they could sort of say, look, there's civil society groups challenging the Guantanamo detainees, there's detentions, there's all kinds of reactions here, and they could tell a soft diplomacy story. But it was a tricky ethical issue for me at the beginning.
Well, I haven't seen it in my own work. To me, when I teach international criminal law, I have large corpus of human rights students. I have military students, JAG, would-be or current JAGs. I have students who are in the CIA, and because of the need to respond honestly to all the different varieties of point of view, it tends to keep things on an even keel in teaching. And because I'm not really dependent in my research on funding from outsiders, there isn't much of a threat to objectivity, to scholarly objectivity in research.
Let me ask Father Madigan, because in a couple of the articles that you've written, I read in preparing for this, you talk about some of the difficulties in the kind of really intense, deep, theologically oriented interfaith dialogue that you've undertaken, wherein there's almost this effect of trying to bend over backwards to create the sense, in the case of your work between Christians and Muslims, that there may be more commonalities than there actually are in some of the readings of the scriptures and so on and so forth. I mean, that seems very clear, and in terms of your own work, you say it's important that we get at these two, because we have to understand the differences as well as the similarities. But, I mean, are you more worried about identifying differences than similarities at this point in time, given your other concerns?
No, actually, I think there are a lot of people working on similarities, and I tend to go for the differences more than anything else. But what I work on is how to understand the differences properly, and how to take the differences seriously, rather than simply say, okay, we're different. We could sit down and list all the things that we have in common, and that's fine. We have all these wonderful deals in common. But the differences are much more interesting, and I suppose what I try to do is to develop a language in which we can disagree fruitfully. because the disagreements are creative. I mean, to really hear what the Muslim critique of Christian theology is very useful to Christian theology, because it sends us back to the drawing board to really come to grips with that issue in another way, because more than 1 billion people don't find our version of it convincing. So we have to rethink how we're proposing that. So I don't shy away from the differences. I try to teach students how to differ in a civil and creative and respectful way. One of the principles I use, and I guess it's in most of the classes I've had I've always had a Muslim. There's always been Muslim students in the class as well as Christians, and sometimes Jewish and Hindu students as well. But I always try to speak as though there is a Muslim present. It's very easy, I think, to get into a situation where you're speaking to an exclusively Christian group to start talking about, you make the slight joke, just the slight, to speak about the other as though you are always in the presence of the other, I think is a professional standard that I try to keep to, and so that Muslims would always recognize in what I say their tradition, their faith, even though I may have questions about it and I have another take on it than they do, but that for me is the professional standard I'd like to see everyone.
I think it's an old chestnut in academic circles to encourage the idea of interdisciplinarity, and the cross-fertilization of ideas across disciplines. I'm wondering if after 9/11 there were particular attractions to interdisciplinary work that any of you found, or was it no more useful than it might have been before for you? Maybe start at the end. Please.
Okay. I've always been an interdisciplinary, and I'm a fraud on the law faculty in that I have a philosophy degree but no law degree. And so there's always been this sense of I've got to learn this whole new discipline. I've had 30 years to do it, and I'm almost there. For the work that I've done post 9/11, there's been a lot more need for interdisciplinarity. So, for example, when I was studying the commander-in-chief power, that required a great deal of research on military history, and I was guided by working with military historians and ancient historians, also with American historians who study the founding era. I think that trying to figure out what goes on in the torture memos requires talking to experts who work with torture survivors and those who do research on PTSD among torture victims to try to figure out what the psychological effects of torture that's not physical in the same way that medieval stuff was physical operates. So I think that there's a huge need in studying the current legal issues to breach the wall between disciplines and work with political scientists, historians, psychologists.
Father Manning.
Yeah, I guess my original discipline was history rather than theology, and I've always kind of worked in an interdisciplinary way, that way in Islamic Studies. But the current situation has required me to do a lot more with politics and to understand the current politics of the Middle East and the nature of post-colonial societies, to try and, in some respects, what I try to do is to de-theologize the explanations, because many people come to this, come with their questions presuming that I will give them a religious answer to, why was there 9/11, why are there suicide bombers and so on. I want to be able to give them a broader range of explanatory tools for why there are these conflict situations. So, what's going on in Nigeria between Muslims and Christians. What is the role of race? What is the role of post-colonial politics? What is the role of the history and such like in every situation? So the teaching has necessarily pushed me to. I obviously can't master like David. I don't claim to have mastered any of these things, but the risk is that in a society that wants a religious answer to these questions, wants to interpret everything as an irreducible religious conflict, that you lose sight of the things that are really fueling conflict.
Well, political science is by its very essence an interdisciplinary field. The only thing we have in common is that we study politics, but we borrow from economics and sociology and psychology. 2 years ago, one of my graduate students won a Georgetown award for the best dissertation in social sciences. She drew on her work as a lawyer. She actually did some content analysis of legal briefs. She did some focus groups to have some sociology about how people would talk about these issues, responding to one another. She had a little experiment it built into a survey, which drew on psychology. It was a really, truly first-rate dissertation, in part because it drew from every possible source it could to bear on the question she was writing on.
Thank you. Let me see now if we have any questions or comments from the floor. We have a microphone set up in the center row for those of you who might. So let me invite someone to do that. I think that's... And if you'd please identify yourself, Michael. We'll just have it for the record.
Well, thank you. I'm Michael Kessler. I have one question, then another one, but I'll ask it and defer if anybody comes. You've all talked a lot about your academic work and the work of your colleagues and some of the interests of students. I'm curious about the other aspect, the institutional responses of developing curriculum. We all hear of tropes about the demands for new courses and for students being interested in studying particular regions. If you look at the American Academy of Religion, again this year, the job openings is overwhelmingly tilted towards Islamic studies of one sort or another. There's a couple of biblical studies and not a lot in a lot of other of the traditional areas or even new areas of the study of religion. So I'm curious to hear in the various disciplines from your various perspectives what institutions are facing in terms of student demand, in terms of curriculum growth. Are there new directions for curriculum that you see coming down the horizon?
I don't think long-term for political science it's a really big change for our curriculum. In terms of my own classes, I teach American politics with a little comparative politics thrown in. I get a lot more comparative students now who are interested in talking about religion and politics and then comparing it to Turkey or to Egypt or something like that. So my lesson plans change, my assigned readings change, but I really don't think we're offering very many different courses in the government department.
Well, I think, as you note, there's been an explosion in, perhaps that's the wrong word.
Greater interest, yes.
Yes, an exponential growth in the field of Islamic studies in U.S. institutions, as indeed in others. I think that one of the factors that comes in here, and I think it has changed substantially, is that it's at a particular time in the development of the U.S. Muslim community that you've got a lot more Muslim academics rather than people like myself who are teaching about a religion which is not their own. You have all this hiring that's been going on since 9/11 has brought a lot more Muslims into the academy, and that's been a very fruitful thing. I think at the same time, because institutions don't always have a Department of Islamic Studies, they feel as though they want something in Islam, and so they end up hiring someone in another department, and I think that contributes to interdisciplinarity in a fruitful way. So you find people who are, the campus Muslim is in the classics department because, they say, okay, well, classics, they're old stuff that can go in there. You find people in the philosophy department, even people who are really Islamic studies people or religious studies people will end up in other departments, and that can be, if it works okay. I mean, sometimes they feel isolated, but in a lot of cases it helps interdisciplinarity, and I think that needs noting.
Yeah, I think the most visible changes in the law school curriculum have been, well, first that we have added a graduate certificate in national security law that might have happened anyway, given that we're located in Washington. But I suspect that it's a reaction to 9/11 and Afghanistan and Iraq. Second, we've started a Center for National Security and the Law. I'm actually currently the director. The founding director was Neil Katyal, who was one of our professors, who's now the Deputy Solicitor General in the Obama administration. And literally dozens of courses that have been added, including courses taught by adjuncts who put in proposals to the law school. We had one course that was offered 2 or 3 times that was on the legal issues arising in the TV show 24. I could not imagine that existing before, without 9/11, just as I couldn't really imagine 24 existing in anything like its current form before 9/11. So the underlying law school curriculum is more or less the same, but we offer hundreds of courses, and I think that there are probably dozens of courses that are responses to 9/11 directly or indirectly.
Let me ask, coming out of these answers, within the faculties themselves, on the controversial or difficult issues that you've each mentioned, I realize these are not debating societies, but do you find that a wide range of views is available to the students on these various issues, or have faculty tended, not unanimously, but in a large sense, to congregate around a certain position on issue X, Y, or Z? That would be for all of you, but let's start down at the end.
Well, you certainly find the full range of issues at the law school. I mean, I'm not going to disguise the fact that it is a famously liberal law school, but the full range of opinions is represented. Just to give one concrete example, 2 of our faculty members are David Cole and Viet Dinh. Viet Dinh is a very conservative lawyer who wrote the USA Patriot Act. David Cole does an enormous amount of pro bono work for the ACLU and litigates against the USA Patriot Act. When David published a book, he asked to have Viet be the commentator on the book when we had public events about it, and then they did a kind of road show, and that's the kind of difference of opinion that I'm talking about. The fact is that probably the Davids outnumber the Viets on the law faculty, but the whole range of opinions is there.
Father Madigan.
I think, well, here probably, the issue is less difficult. In the theology department, we have a lot of people in religious studies, and one of the focuses of the department is religious pluralism, so we're kind of used to rolling with the punches in the relations of different religions to one another. In Rome, obviously, it was a lot more difficult, I think, to get this kind of common approach to what is seems a fairly radical option in interfaith work. But just one thing to add a bit to the response to Michael's question. In our department, we've started in recent years a doctoral program focusing on religious pluralism, and of the 17 students we now have in the doctoral program, about 75% are working on Islam and Christianity. So they're both Muslims and Christians, but that's by far the most popular study. The students they specialize in 2 traditions and do comparative and relational work. So that has certainly affected our curriculum.
Is that by design of the program or just the way things are going at this point?
Well, I think it's both in terms of student demand. I mean, even in terms of the applications we get, that's by far the largest group of students wants to do this kind of thing. But also Georgetown has a lot more resources in the study of Islam and Christianity than it does, say, in Asian religions, for example. And we're unfortunately not as strong as we would like to be in Judaism.
Yeah, on this issue, I think the government department's pretty diverse. I doubt if many of my colleagues were, giving large contributions to John McCain. But at the end of the day, we have a very strong national security studies program where people are thinking very seriously about what works in dealing with terrorism. We have a conflict resolution program, which is also thinking in a different way about what works to deter it. We have neoconservatives, we have social constructivists, we have people who really are all across the spectrum on this particular issue. So students would have access to them. What we don't really have is a lively interchange, right? So someone can take a faculty member who has one point of view and then a different faculty member with a different point of view, but we don't have a structure for kind of working that together and do any kind of coherent program for them.
Do you think that would be useful, or is that just going to get more complicated than it's worth?
My colleagues are all bright, intelligent people who are confident that they're right. And so I'm not sure necessarily if having them sitting together with the graduate students listening to them would bring any light to the problem or not.
Please.
Sorry about that. I have a rather related question in the context of the case of Professor John Yoo at Berkeley. You must all be familiar with that. There are very strong opinions on both sides of the question of whether he should be teaching there. And some students and I think even faculty have attempted to stop him from teaching at Berkeley. The dean recently sent an email to the whole academic community at Berkeley, essentially expressing his own disagreement with Professor Yu's views, but casting it as an issue of academic freedom. And so, David Luban mentioned that we have Professor Din at the law school here, but we haven't had a person at Georgetown who has become the focus of such intense debate as to whether, and this is really what my question gets down to, whether there are some views that would not be defended on the basis of academic freedom. And so my question is, in each of your disciplines, has the aftermath of 9/11 presented to you, or can you imagine views that if held by a colleague, you would feel shouldn't be defended on the basis of academic freedom or disseminated by that person as a professor?
Very good question. Why don't we start with Father Madigan in the middle this time?
Yeah, I do think there are views that shouldn't be defended on the basis of academic freedom. I'm not sure about the methods for handling all that, but I think most people agree, for example, that basically anti-Semitic, Holocaust denial, various things like that. I don't know. I'm not an American, so maybe that's okay. But I think there are other positions also, which sort of analogous positions, which really shouldn't be tolerated.
If I may ask, has 9/11
it's part of the nature of the theology
any
discipline that you have opinions, of course. But I'm not sure that the freedom to vilify another tradition is defensible.
Ms. Wilcox, you want to?
Well, this is really a law story, right?
Yeah.
Wu, so maybe.
I've been among the strongest critics of the torture memos and other memos that John Yoo wrote in his service in the Justice Department, but I actually think that tenure and academic freedom exist to protect professors against the opinions of people like me, and vice versa. So, I mean, here would be my rough cut. I mean, what we are talking about in this case is not a range of opinions expressed in academia, but actions taken as a public official. I think they were wrong, but what I think shouldn't count. If a professor is, let's say, convicted of a crime, then what's the university's stake in it? The university should ascertain whether that crime has anything to do with the professor's academic responsibilities. I mean, I don't think it's the university's job to say, oh, well, you knocked somebody's jaw loose in a barroom brawl, and therefore we think that we're going to take away your tenure and you don't teach here any longer, because I don't think that has anything much to do with academic work, unless this is somebody who is sort of uncontrollable and posing a danger to his or her students. So I think that academic freedom, I mean, to me, it's close to an absolute, what the university is about, and also the disconnect between outside conduct and the academy is something that's got to be respected. So I think that if somebody's outside actions, criminal actions, what have you, affect their academic work, that's grounds for the university to act, but nothing else is.
Did you want to comment on that?
Yeah, I'd just say that, I agree that, with tenure, the function of academic freedom is that unpopular ideas get to be really played out in the marketplace, and we presume they lose. But in hiring, it's a little bit slightly more complicated because not all ideas are equally plausible. And, you can come in and make a wide range of positions in American politics, but there's some where there's really be no evidence, this would be really contrary to anything we believe. And so in a hiring position, I never take into account someone's Democrat, Republican, liberal, conservative. I hardly ever would know that. But if someone came in and made a terribly implausible argument about the Constitution or about something else, then, I would be much less inclined to vote to hire them.
Were you, well, please.
Yes, my question relates to about 9/11. You've often heard it said that 9/11 was a failure, happened because there was a failure of imagination. And I wonder if there aren't things that a university community, a faculty could do to provide some kind of preparation for some sort of wider changes in our society that are inevitably going to lead to, other kinds of terrorists as our world, and especially in the United States, has changed. Are there ways that those of your faculty can anticipate or look forward rather than just reacting to the post 9/11?
Who'd like to go first on that?
Let me have a bash at it. I was talking before about objectivity and so on, and I think perhaps what we have often is a failure of empathy as much as a failure of imagination, which empathy is a kind of imagination. I think a lot of people didn't see this coming because they didn't take seriously the fact that there is anger against the U.S. and various other parts of the what should we say, the nations that control the world's power and the world's economy. What we can do is to give people a realistic view of the world and an understanding of what it's like to live in these places, what it's like to perceive that the dictator who is oppressing you is being supported and armed by the U.S. or by some other some European powers and so on. I think a lot of it comes down to that. If we take seriously the anger and that's behind things like 9/11 and look at the causes of that anger, then I think we've got a better chance of dealing with it in the future. If we take the kind of Huntington option or the sort of theological option, which says, well, these people, just because of their religion, they're always going to be against us. It doesn't matter what we do. It doesn't matter about the economics or the politics of it. It's simply about religion. Then I think we're not going to move towards a helpful understanding of the future. But in a broad way to understand the politics and the economics and the history, that will help us in the future.
Well, I tend to see this as more a temperamental and disciplinary matter. So the temperamental matter is that there are some people who are really good futurologists in the academy and have tremendous imaginations about things that might happen. I, alas, am not one of them. I'm more when events happen, I try to think through the implications of the events, but my gifts of prophecy are very slight, and I think that that's true in all the disciplines. I also said it's a disciplinary matter because obviously there are some things in the university in which that's just not their job. Somebody who is teaching a course on Milton, I mean, it's Paradise Lost. The heavenly muse should continue to sing, and it's not their job to imagine future catastrophes and how we would respond to them. I mean, there are those parts of the university in which it would be really great if we had, if we could see what was coming. I think of law schools as being one of them because they're very event-driven and public affairs-oriented. But I think that whether you've got the power of imagination to do that is very much a matter of individuals.
Let me ask for the last word here from Clyde Wilcox, but just to recall some of your initial comments about political science's somewhat checkered past in predicting the future, the fall of the Soviet Union being the most salient example. So I'm not meaning to set you up quite this way, but please.
Well, I think that what he said is exactly right, that there are some people in all professions who are really gifted at being able to read trends and to think creatively. And what I've always tried to do is keep an email contact with those people. So if I'm thinking about a problem, I try to run it by them because I think they can do a better job of predicting than I can. Many faculty, though, you're on an ongoing research program. You're kind of committed to one way of looking at the world, and we should be more creative, but we're not. But that's why God made graduate students, right? The way that professions move, the way that political science gets new ideas is when the young people are choosing what to study and choosing the framework and whatever, that's when they're really open, and that's when they can look at, and they have to make a gamble because they're gambling their career on their first book project or the dissertation project, that this is going to be something that's interesting. So the way my profession actually moves is more by generational replacement and then a few really bright people being able to forecast.
Well, let me thank our panelists for a wonderful discussion and thank the Berkeley Center and thank all of you for coming. And we look forward at the National September 11th the Memorial Museum to further programs jointly with Georgetown and the Berkeley Center. Thank you all.